You'd think your own home would be the safest place in the world, right? That's what I believed until I discovered that not everyone is thrilled about the idea of security cameras. In my neighborhood, one particular HOA board member, yes, another Karen, turned my quest for home safety into a scandal that spiraled completely out of control. And the craziest part, I caught her doing something that changed everything. Stick around to learn the shocking secret that my cameras uncovered. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment if you've ever had to deal with neighbors who think they own the entire block. Let's dive in. I never considered myself a particularly paranoid person, but after a spate of package thefts in our area, I decided it was time to install a couple of discreet security cameras around my property. My wife, Sophie, was the one who initially urged me to do it. She'd heard enough horror stories about neighbors losing entire deliveries, everything from electronics to medication, right off their porches. So I went online, found a budget-friendly set of cameras, and spent a weekend getting them installed. We'd only been in the neighborhood for 6 months. Most of our neighbors seemed pleasant enough, but there was that undercurrent of strictness, reinforced by the presence of our HOA. While they kept the community looking tidy, some of the rules were borderline absurd. Grass height could only be so many inches. You needed approval for any exterior paint changes, and apparently any modifications that could affect the visual uniformity of the streets required board approval. Still, I assumed security cameras fell under a reasonable category of home improvement, especially when crime had been on the rise in the county. If anything, I thought the HOA might appreciate the added layer of protection. But the day after I installed them, I came home to a note pinned to my door with a bright red, urgent stamp on it. The note said cameras must be removed within 48 hours to comply with community guidelines regarding privacy and shared space. Failure to do so will result in a violation. It was signed simply, Karen, HOA President. I stared at the note, baffled. Privacy? These cameras were only pointed at my front door and the edge of my driveway, capturing the sidewalk at best. There was no angle that peered into someone else's property. I showed Sophie, and she was equally stunned. "This is ridiculous. You're within your rights to have cameras," she said, crossing her arms defiantly. We decided to check the HOA bylaws, scanning for any mention of surveillance devices. Nothing, not a single clause about security cameras. Undeterred, I marched to Karen's house the next day, the note in hand. Karen was a petite woman in her 50s who carried herself like a drill sergeant. She greeted me with a thin-lipped smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Yes, how can I help you?" she said, clearly feigning politeness. I held up the note. "Can you point me to the specific rule I'm violating? Because I've read the bylaws and I can't find anything about cameras." Karen let out a sharp, condescending laugh. "Well, you won't find it specifically mentioned. We consider cameras a violation of community privacy standards. Residents have the right to not be recorded without their consent." I tried explaining that the camera was only capturing my property, but she dismissed my arguments. She gave me one final statement: remove them or face the violation and accompanying fines. This is non-negotiable. I walked away frustrated, feeling my blood pressure spike. That evening, I emailed the HOA board, including the vice president and secretary, requesting a formal review of this so-called policy. 2 days passed with no response. Then came the official HOA violation notice in my mailbox, slapped with a $100 fine. Here's where things took an unexpected turn. I was about to concede and reposition the cameras to appease them, until one night my motion sensors alerted me to a figure sneaking across my lawn. When I checked the feed, I couldn't believe who I saw lurking in the shadows. It was someone I least expected, and what they did next changed the entire battle with Karen forever. That night, I'd been dozing on the couch when a ping on my phone told me the front camera had detected movement. I glanced at the screen, expecting maybe a stray cat or a raccoon. Instead, the shape was clearly human. Nervous, I watched for a moment, fumbling to switch from night vision to normal feed. The figure advanced along the side of my house, glancing over their shoulder every few seconds. Even in the grainy view, I recognized the short stature and the silhouette of carefully coiffed hair. It was Karen. She appeared to be holding something in her hand. My pulse quickened. Why would she be sneaking around my property at midnight? Did she think the cameras wouldn't catch her if she approached from the side? I watched in stunned silence as she crept up to the camera near the garage and tried to reach it. But the camera was installed too high, so all she managed to do was lightly graze the bottom of it. Then she swiftly crouched down and turned, looking as though she was checking for other cameras or maybe a vantage point that wouldn't be recorded. With my heart pounding, I called the non-emergency police line. I knew I needed official documentation in case she did something crazy. By the time an officer arrived, Karen was long gone, but I showed the officer the footage and he just shook his head. If she didn't cause property damage or force entry, we can't do much, but this is definitely suspicious. You might consider getting a restraining order if this continues, he said. I felt a surge of anger. Here was the HOA president harassing me about privacy while literally trespassing on my property, and I had her on video to prove it. The next day, I sent the footage to the entire HOA board, explaining that I was prepared to take legal action if Karen continued her intimidation tactics. I also pointed out the hypocrisy. She demanded I remove cameras for the sake of privacy, yet she violated my privacy by sneaking around my home. The board's response was silence, no email, no phone call, nothing. Then, about 2 days later, an email from Karen arrived in my inbox. It was a bizarre half-apology, half-threat. She wrote, "I apologize for alarming you the other night. I was simply checking if your cameras were pointed into my property. However, if you continue to operate these cameras, we will have no choice but to escalate the fines." No mention of the fact that she was trespassing at midnight or that she had no right to walk onto my property uninvited. The arrogance was mind-blowing. I consulted with a local attorney who specialized in HOA disputes. Her name was Allison, and she was known around town for her bulldog approach to dealing with overzealous homeowner associations. After reviewing my footage and the bylaws, she was confident we had a strong case if this went to court. She suggested, however, that we first attempt a formal mediation, offering the HOA a chance to rectify the situation without a lawsuit. Meanwhile, the neighbors started talking. Word spread about Karen prowling around my yard. Some supported me, relishing the chance to see Karen taken down a peg. Others whispered that Karen had connections on the board and that crossing her was social suicide. I also discovered that I wasn't the first homeowner to receive a privacy violation notice for cameras. Another resident, an older gentleman named Tim, had been forced to remove his doorbell camera because Karen deemed it an invasion of privacy. He told me he regretted not fighting back, but felt he lacked the resources to do so. With Allison's help, I formally requested a meeting with the board and an impartial mediator. Karen tried to stall by claiming the board was too busy, but we threatened legal action again if they refused. Finally, they relented. The meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday evening in the local library's community room. When Sophie and I arrived, Karen and 2 other board members were already seated at a long table. A professional mediator, a middle-aged woman named Paula, set the ground rules. Paula explained that the goal was to find a resolution without going to court. I went first, presenting my evidence, the violation notice, the lack of any explicit rule about cameras, and most damning of all, the video of Karen creeping onto my property in the middle of the night. I also pointed out that if Karen truly believed I was infringing on neighbors' privacy, she should have initiated a discussion or a vote to amend the bylaws, not issue arbitrary fines and trespass. Karen sat, lips pursed, twisting her pen between her fingers. When her turn came to speak, she leaned into the microphone and tried to spin the story. She claimed she was acting on complaints from neighbors who felt they were being recorded. She also insisted that my camera angles must be capturing her front yard. Paula asked if she had proof. Karen said she had statements, but offered nothing concrete. I countered by showing actual screenshots from the camera feed, blurry images of my driveway, front porch, and the edge of the sidewalk. You could barely see the road, let alone into someone's property. Paula nodded in understanding. Karen, based on these images, it appears that the cameras are only focusing on Mr. Johnson's property, she said gently but firmly. Flustered, Karen pointed her finger at me across the table. He's making it sound innocent, but how do we know he can't zoom in or adjust the angles? These devices are sophisticated. Anyone can spy on others with the right technology, she said, a trace of desperation in her voice. Paula's brow furrowed. That's speculative. Do you have any documentation of this possibility? Karen squirmed in her seat, finally muttering, I just know how technology can be misused. At this point, Sophie chimed in. She explained how the cameras were installed only after packages went missing, emphasizing our right to secure our property. She recounted the anxiety she felt every time a package arrived, worried it would be stolen. Sophie's words seemed to sway the other two board members who were present. They exchanged glances that were more sympathetic to us than to Karen. After nearly 2 hours of back and forth, Paula moved to conclude the mediation. She proposed the board revoke the fines and allow us to keep the cameras, so long as we provided documentation of their angles to reassure neighbors they weren't being recorded. Sophie and I found this reasonable, though we resented needing to prove we weren't secretly spying. It was a concession we could live with. Karen, however, was furious. She turned to the other board members, trying to rally them against the proposal, but they were silent. Realizing she was outnumbered, Karen finally snapped, "Fine, if that's what the board wants." I took a breath, relieved. I thought that might be the end of it, but little did I know Karen wasn't finished. She had a private war to wage against me, one that would escalate far beyond fines and notes. A few days after the mediation, we got a letter from the HOA stating that all previous fines were nullified, and we were free to keep the cameras as long as we maintained them in a respectful manner. It sounded like a flimsy way to save Karen's pride. We complied, sending them the camera specs and angles, highlighting that they pointed exclusively at our property. That peace lasted all of 3 days. One night around 11 p.m., I once again received a motion alert on my phone. Checking the feed, I half expected to see Karen lurking, but instead it was a masked figure creeping up to my porch. My heart raced. This wasn't Karen's silhouette. This person was bigger, broader, dressed in dark clothing, face partially obscured by a hood and a mask. I nudged Sophie awake. My first instinct was to call the police, but I had to see what was happening. The figure crouched near my porch light, and I could see them fiddling with something. Then suddenly a pop and a flash of sparks. The porch light went out, plunging the area into darkness. The camera feed, relying on its own night vision, still caught glimpses. The figure darted away, out of view. I dialed 911, breath shaking. Minutes later, the police arrived, but the intruder was long gone. We found that our porch light bulb had been smashed and the fixture had a small burn mark. The officer took our statement and the camera footage. When I replayed it, something caught my eye. Just before the intruder ducked out of sight, they glanced over their shoulder. Even in the grainy video, the eyes looked familiar, like I seen them behind reading glasses, behind a stern glare. But I couldn't be 100% sure. Speculation bubbled in my mind. Could it have been Karen or someone she enlisted? She was smaller in stature. This figure seemed bigger. Perhaps a friend or relative doing her dirty work. It was a leap, but after everything that had happened, it wasn't far-fetched. A week later, I received a phone call from the local police station. They asked me to come down to identify a suspect they'd apprehended for a series of nighttime vandalisms in the area. Feeling a mix of anxiety and curiosity, I went, flipping through a photo lineup. Sure enough, one of the individuals looked eerily similar to the figure in my footage, only unmasked. I recognized the facial structure, the eyes dark, intense. I told the officer this looked like the intruder. He gave a small nod. "This man has a record of petty crime. We'll investigate further. Thanks for your help." As I left, a detective pulled me aside and asked, "Do you know anyone who might hold a grudge against you? This guy claims he was paid to tamper with a camera in your neighborhood." My stomach did a somersault. Paid? By whom? I had my suspicions, but I didn't want to voice them without evidence. I told the detective about my disputes with Karen, the HOA, the trespassing incident, the countless intimidation tactics. He raised an eyebrow, took notes, and said they would follow up if more evidence came to light. The next few days felt like living under a cloud. Sophie and I dreaded every ring of the doorbell, every unexpected noise outside. Part of me thought maybe we were stuck in a psychological game of cat and mouse. If Karen truly hired someone to vandalize my property, what would she do next? But fate, or perhaps karma, had a way of exposing the truth. A neighbor down the street who had installed a new doorbell camera captured footage of a suspicious car idling the same night my porch light was destroyed. The camera's angle even caught the license plate, partially visible. The detective found that the car was registered to none other than Karen's adult son, who lived in a different city. With that laid, the police questioned him. He claimed he had no idea his car was used for that purpose, that a friend borrowed it. Yet the puzzle pieces were lining up uncomfortably well. The suspect, the borrowed car, the timeline, Karen's ongoing vendetta. The police questioned Karen, and she denied everything. She insisted she had no clue what her son or his friend might have been doing that night. But behind the scenes, rumor spread that the board was quietly considering removing Karen from her position. It was one thing to enforce HOA rules, but another to be implicated, however indirectly, in vandalism. Eventually, the suspect himself spilled a partial confession to get a deal, said he was approached by someone who wanted him to disable some cameras and cause a little panic. No names were mentioned, but the detective told me off the record that Karen remained their prime suspect. In the end, the HOA board announced a special session to discuss recent events and board governance. A week later, they posted a letter publicly stating that Karen was stepping down due to personal reasons. While she wasn't formally charged, lack of direct evidence left the case inconclusive. Her reputation was in shambles. Many neighbors who once feared her were now outspoken in condemning her actions. My cameras stayed up. In fact, a wave of new camera installations swept the neighborhood. Ironically, Karen's crusade against security cameras led to the entire street being monitored like never before. As for me, I never received another fine or complaint from the HOA. And that's how one overzealous HOA president drove herself right out of power in the most ironic twist possible. If you enjoyed this story and want more drama-packed tales, hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and share your own HOA horror stories in the comments. Thanks for watching and stay safe out there.